The station smelled like cold metal and old air. Admiral Sarah Voss had noticed that the moment she stepped off the transport shuttle. It was the kind of smell that told you a place had been built for function, not for comfort. The Galactic Accord Tribunal Station was exactly that. It was a large, rotating structure, floating in neutral space, far from any single planet, far from any government that might try to influence what happened inside its walls. It was supposed to be a place of fairness. Voss was not convinced. She walked down the long corridor toward the main chamber, with her second-in-command, Commander Tev Halleck, at her side. Halleck was a tall man with short dark hair, and the kind of face that never showed much emotion. He was good at that. Voss had always admired it. Right now, she needed to be good at it too. Around them, the station staff moved quickly and quietly. Most of them were not human. Voss passed a tall, thin creature with gray skin and 4 arms. It glanced at her and looked away fast. She passed a group of smaller beings with wide orange eyes. They stopped talking when she walked by. She noticed all of it. She always noticed. The charges had arrived 3 weeks ago. They came in the form of a formal document, sealed with the marks of 7 different civilizations, transmitted directly to Earth's Terran Defense Command. The document was long. Very long. The language was formal and stiff, the kind of writing that took simple things and made them sound complicated. But when Voss had sat down and read through it carefully, the message inside was simple enough. The Galactic Accord believed that humanity had fought dirty. The charges listed were many: psychological warfare, environmental weaponization, use of biological agents, violation of the Accord's established rules of civilized combat. Each charge came with evidence attached: recordings, sensor logs, field reports written by alien military observers who had watched the Battle of the Cathara Corridor from a safe distance. Each piece of evidence had been carefully labeled and organized. Someone had worked very hard to build this case. She had read it once slowly, then again quickly. Then she had put the document down on her desk and sat very still for a long moment. Then she had smiled. Halleck had been standing nearby when she did that. He had raised an eyebrow. She had simply told him to pack for a trip. The main chamber of the tribunal was large and shaped like a half-circle. The ceiling was high. The walls were made of a pale gray material that seemed to absorb sound. At the far end of the room sat the Grand Council, 7 delegates, one from each of the civilizations that had filed charges against Earth. They sat behind a long, curved bench, elevated above the floor, looking down at the small platform where Voss and Halleck now stood. Voss looked at each of them in turn. She had studied their species before coming. The delegate on the far left was Arbiter Putan from the Vethkai Collective. His species were insectoid, hard-shelled, compound-eyed, with mandibles that clicked softly when they spoke. He was the one who had organized the charges, the main prosecutor. He sat very straight and watched her with those large, unblinking eyes. To his right sat a smaller creature wrapped in moisture-sealed clothing. That was the delegate from the Drell Dominion, Ambassador Drell himself, an aquatic reptilian species that needed water-rich air to breathe comfortably. His eyes were half-closed and heavy-lidded, but Voss had read enough about his kind to know that did not mean he was relaxed. It meant he was thinking hard. The others she noted and filed away. She would deal with them as needed. A low tone sounded through the chamber. The session was beginning. Arbiter Kutan leaned forward slightly and spoke. His voice came through a translation device built into the bench. It turned his clicking, layered language into flat human words. Admiral Voss, of the Terran Defense Fleet, you stand before the Grand Tribunal of the Galactic Accord, representing the human species of the planet Earth. This body has received and reviewed 47 formal charges against the military forces under your command, arising from the events of the Battle of the Cathara Corridor, which took place in the 3rd month of the current Galactic Standard Year. Do you understand the charges brought against you? Voss let the question sit in the air for a moment. The chamber was very quiet. Somewhere in the high gallery above, she could hear the faint sound of other beings, shifting in their seats. Observers, reporters, diplomats from a dozen worlds who had come to watch whatever was going to happen here. "I have read the charges," she said. Her voice was calm and even. Kuthan's mandibles clicked once. "Then you are aware that the actions described in this document represent a serious breach of the standards of conduct that all members of the Galactic Accord have agreed to uphold. The Accord's rules of civilized combat exist to ensure that warfare between member species remains limited, controlled, and free from acts that cause unnecessary suffering or destabilization." "I am aware of what the rules say," Voss replied. "Then you are also aware," Kuthan continued, "that the actions taken by your forces during the Cathara engagement violated those rules in multiple and significant ways. Your soldiers used the local terrain to conceal sensor-defeating compounds. They broadcast disruptive sound frequencies on open military channels. They executed a staged retreat designed to lure enemy forces into a geological trap, which was then deliberately triggered. And when surrounded and outmatched, rather than issuing the recognized signal of acknowledged defeat, your soldiers responded with—" He paused, as if the next word was difficult. "Laughter." A murmur ran through the gallery. Kuthan pressed on. "These actions caused significant casualties, psychological distress among surviving Vethkai personnel, and a general disruption of the accepted framework of armed engagement. It is the position of this tribunal that such behavior cannot be permitted among civilized species." He folded his upper arms across his chest. "How does humanity plead?" Every eye in the room turned to Voss. The delegates leaned forward. Even the faint background hum of the station seemed to quiet down, as if the building itself wanted to hear what she would say. Sarah Voss stood with her hands loosely clasped behind her back. She looked up at Kuthan, then at the rest of the council, one face at a time. Her expression was calm. It was the expression of someone who had thought carefully about this moment, and had already decided how it would end. Then she smiled. It was a slow smile, quiet, the kind of smile that is not about being happy. It was the kind of smile that meant something else entirely. The kind that appeared on the face of someone who knew something the room did not yet know. The gallery murmured again, louder this time. Several of the delegates shifted in their seats. Ambassador Drell, the aquatic reptilian on Kuthan's right, went very still. "We'll be entering a plea," Voss said, "after the evidence has been presented in full." She paused. "All of it." Kuthan's mandibles clicked 3 times, in rapid succession. It took a moment for Voss to realize that was probably the Vethkai equivalent of a frown. The session was called to order. The evidence phase was scheduled to begin the following morning. That night, alone in the small room the station had assigned her, Voss sat at the edge of her bunk and looked at the wall. Through the small porthole window, she could see stars. Somewhere out there, past the edges of what she could see, were the ships of the Terran fleet. 7 cruisers and their support vessels, sitting in holding pattern at the edge of the neutral zone, waiting. She thought about what was coming tomorrow. She thought about the recordings they would play, and the alien faces that would watch them. She thought about her soldiers at Cathara, what they had done, why they had done it, how they had laughed. The smile came back, quieter this time, more real. She lay down and closed her eyes. Tomorrow, the gallery would see what humanity looked like when it fought, and then they would understand why the smile was not arrogance. It was just the truth. The playback chamber was smaller than the main tribunal hall, but it felt more uncomfortable. The ceiling was lower. The air was slightly warmer. 7 large holographic projectors were arranged in a wide circle around the center of the room, and when they powered on, the space between them filled with light and movement. A 3-dimensional reconstruction of a battlefield, pulled from sensor logs and field recordings. Every delegate had been given a seat close enough to see the details. Voss sat at the respondents' table to one side. Halleck was beside her. She kept her hands flat on the table in front of her, and watched the projection with an expression that gave nothing away. Arbiter Kutan stood near the edge of the projection field, with a thin data rod in one hand. He pointed it at the center of the display, like a teacher at a board. "What you are about to see," he said, "are authenticated recordings from the Battle of the Cathara Corridor. These recordings were captured by Accord-certified observation units present at the engagement. They have been reviewed and confirmed as accurate by the tribunal's own technical staff. We will present them in chronological order." He tapped the rod. The projection shifted and came into focus. The Cathara Corridor was a narrow passage of space between two rocky moons, close enough to a gas giant that the atmospheric interference made conventional sensor sweeps unreliable. That, the prosecution's notes explained, was why the Vethkai Collective had chosen it as a route for their supply line. It seemed safe. The interference would hide them. It had not hidden them from the humans. The first recording showed a group of Terran infantry, 12 soldiers in dark gray environmental suits, moving through a low, rocky valley on the surface of the smaller moon. They were doing something that made several of the alien delegates lean forward with confusion. They were smearing the rocks and ground around them with a dark, thick substance from canisters they carried on their backs. This material, Kutan said, was a compound of local mineral dust, moisture, and a processed organic binding agent. When spread across a surface and allowed to dry, it produces a layer that scatters standard sensor signals at multiple frequencies. The human forces use this compound to hide their position from Vethkai scanning equipment. He paused. They covered a 2-kilometer stretch of the valley floor and the surrounding ridgelines. By the time our forces entered sensor range, the entire area appeared empty. One of the other delegates, a wide, flat-bodied creature from the Mulhan assembly, made a low sound that the translation device rendered as something like, "clever." Kutan turned slightly toward the sound, and then turned back. The compound itself was assembled from materials found on the moon's surface. The humans brought the binding agent. The rest was local. This is, under Article 14 of the Accord's combat regulations, classified as environmental weaponization. The recording moved forward in time. The projection changed. Now the valley was filled with Vethkai soldiers, hundreds of them, compact and hard-shelled, moving in tight formation through the pass. They moved with confidence. Their sensors showed nothing ahead of them. The corridor was clear. Then the sound began. It came over the open military broadcast channels, the shared frequencies that all forces in a combat zone were required to monitor. The Vethkai communicators picked it up immediately, and it blared through every helmet speaker in the formation. It was loud, layered, and deeply strange. It had a hard, rhythmic beat underneath it, and a screaming sound on top. It did not resemble any communication signal. It did not resemble anything the Vethkai military had ever heard. Several Vethkai soldiers in the recording stopped walking. 2 of them grabbed their head coverings. The formation began to lose its shape as soldiers tried to make sense of what was happening. In the corner of the projection, tiny and distant on a high ridgeline, a single human soldier sat with a small broadcast device. He appeared to be nodding his head in time with the noise. "This audio broadcast," Kutan said, and his mandibles clicked with what Voss had begun to read as agitation, was deliberate psychological interference. The sound used was a form of human music, specifically a genre known as heavy metal, selected for its frequency range and volume, which tests conducted after the battle confirmed was maximally disorienting for Vethkai auditory biology. The broadcast continued for 11 minutes. Another pause. Article 9 of the Combat Regulations prohibits the use of psychological interference weapons. Ambassador Drell, who had been very still, turned his heavy-lidded eyes toward Voss. She did not look back at him. She was watching the projection. The recording jumped again. This was the part Voss had been waiting for. She had seen the raw footage before. Her soldiers had sent her copies before the tribunal had even filed its first document. But she watched it again carefully, looking at it the way the aliens in this room would look at it. The projection showed a wide canyon, deep. The walls were steep and close together. At one end of the canyon, a force of roughly 80 Terran soldiers was retreating, clearly retreating, falling back in good order, firing behind them as they moved. Pursuing them was a Vethkai force that outnumbered them 6-1. The Vethkai commander's signals, the Accord observers had noted at the time, were confident. The humans were beaten, they were running. Except, they were not running quite fast enough. They were running at exactly the speed needed to keep the pursuing force moving forward. They were pulling the enemy deeper into the canyon. When the last human soldier had cleared the far end of the passage, the canyon walls came down. The humans had spent 2 days placing shaped charges along the fault lines of the canyon walls. When the signal was given, every charge fired in sequence. The canyon roof did not explode. It collapsed. Controlled, deliberate, and total. The pursuing Vethkai force was caught in the middle of it. The gallery above the playback chamber had been silent for most of the presentation. Now Voss heard voices up there. Low, disturbed murmuring. She heard what might have been the Mulhan equivalent of a gasp. Kuthon let the projection run a moment longer, then stopped it. The casualty count from this action alone was 217 Vethkai soldiers. His voice was flat and controlled, but the mandibles would not stop clicking. Article 22 of the Accord's Combat Regulations explicitly prohibits the deliberate triggering of geological events as a weapon of war. The reasoning is simple. Such events cannot be limited or recalled. They cause destruction that extends beyond any military necessity. He looked at Voss directly. She met his eyes. She gave him nothing. But the recordings do not end there, Kuthon said. He tapped the data rod again. The final clip was shorter than the others. It showed a small group of Terran soldiers, no more than 15, who had become separated from the main force. They were surrounded. Vethkai units had them on 3 sides with no exit. The Accord's observers had flagged this as a likely surrender event. The Vethkai commander had broadcast the standard signal, the universal pattern that meant, in every language in the Accord, that a combatant should stand down and accept capture. The humans looked at each other. Then one of them started laughing. It spread. Within seconds, several of them were laughing. Real, deep, honest laughter. The Vethkai commander broadcast the signal again. The laughter got louder. Then the humans attacked. 15 soldiers against 60. They did not win cleanly, but they broke out. 3 of them died doing it. The rest escaped into the terrain and rejoined the main force. The projection went dark. Kuthon set down his data rod. He looked out at the room, at his fellow delegates, at the gallery, and finally at Voss. These are not the actions of a military force operating within the bounds of civilized conduct. These are the actions of a species that does not understand, or does not care, what those bounds are meant to protect. He spread all 4 of his arms slightly, a gesture his species used when making a point of great weight. We are not here to punish humanity for being effective. We are here because what we saw in those recordings was not warfare as this Accord has ever known it. It was something else. And we deserve to know what that something else is. He sat down. The room was quiet for a long moment. Voss looked at Halleck. He gave her the smallest of nods. She looked back at the now dark projectors in the center of the room, where the canyon had just collapsed, and 15 soldiers had just laughed in the face of 60 armed enemies. She thought, yes, she supposed she owed them an explanation. She was going to enjoy giving it. The next morning, the chamber felt different. Voss could not have said exactly what had changed. The room was the same. The seats were in the same places. The 7 delegates sat behind the same curved bench. But the atmosphere was heavier now, the way air feels before a storm. The aliens in the gallery were quieter. The delegates themselves seemed to be sitting more carefully, more deliberately, as if they had all spent the night thinking about what they had watched. Voss had spent the night reading. When the session was called to order, Kuthon offered her the floor. His voice was polite and formal. His mandibles were very still. She noticed that, when they were moving, he was agitated. When they were still, he was being careful. Good. That meant he was taking this seriously. Voss stood up from the respondents' table. She did not bring notes. She did not bring a legal team. She walked to the center of the floor, where witnesses stood to give testimony, and she looked up at the 7 delegates. "I'd like to use the display," she said. Kuthon gave a small nod. The holographic projectors came back on, but dim. Just a soft glow waiting for input. Voss connected her data drive to the chamber's shared system. A document appeared in the projection. Old. The formatting was simple, the text ancient by any standard. She let the delegates look at it for a moment. "This is a book," she said. "It was written on Earth, approximately 2,500 years ago. Its author was a man named Sun Tzu. He was a military commander and strategist. The book is called The Art of War." She looked at the projection. "I'm going to read a few lines from it." She read, "All warfare is based on deception. When able to attack, we must seem unable. When near, we must make the enemy believe we are far away. Hold out baits to entice the enemy. When he seeks rest, give him no peace." She let that sit. 2,500 years ago, she said again. This was not a new idea when it was written. The strategies it describes were already old then. They had been used by human armies for centuries before Sun Tzu put them into words. He simply organized them. She tapped her drive. A second document appeared beside the first. Different format. Later period. This is from a Prussian general named Karl von Clausewitz. 19th century Earth. He wrote, "War is the continuation of politics by other means. The object of war is not fighting. The object of war is achieving a result. Fighting is only the tool." She tapped again. A third document. A fourth. She built them up on the display one by one. Centuries of human military writing stacking beside each other in the projection. Names and titles and dates that meant nothing to the aliens in the room, but whose content, read aloud in flat translation, began to form a pattern that even non-human minds could follow. Musashi on patience, Patton on aggression, Rommel on flexibility, Napoleon on speed, a dozen more, each one adding a piece to something larger. The gallery had gone very quiet. The delegates were leaning forward. "I want to explain something to this tribunal," Voss said. Her voice was still calm, still even. She was not angry, she was not performing. She was speaking the way she would speak to a room full of officers being briefed on something important. The Accord's rules of civilized combat were written by species who reached the stars before humans did. You had already settled into your place in the galaxy. You had already established what warfare looked like. Formal, bounded, with accepted signals and expected behaviors. You created those rules in a context where the species involved had relatively stable histories. No species in this room, as best as I've been able to learn, ever came close to destroying itself. She paused. Humans did. Repeatedly. She kept going. In Earth's recorded history, we have survived plagues that killed 1/3 of our entire population. We have survived wars that flattened whole cities in a matter of days. We came, on more than one occasion, to within a single decision of ending our civilization with our own weapons. We have had famines, floods, collapses of governments and economies, and systems we had built over generations. She looked at Kuthon. And every single time, we got back up. That is not something that happens by accident. That is not something that happens because a species is lucky. What you saw in those recordings, the sensor compounds, the sound broadcasts, the staged retreat, the laughter when surrounded, that is not a violation of your rules. That is what 2,500 years of refinement looks like. That is what a species produces when it has had to fight for its survival with everything it had, against enemies that were sometimes its own neighbors, sometimes its own governments, sometimes its own choices. She tapped the drive one final time. The display filled with a long scrolling list. Battles, dates, locations. The names meant nothing to the aliens. The sheer length of the list did. Every strategy your prosecution called a violation was used by humans against other humans long before any of your species found us. The sensor deception was used in a conflict we call the Second World War, nearly 400 years before first contact. The psychological audio weapon has roots in ancient warfare. The feigned retreat is in Sun Tzu, which is to say, it is at least 2,500 years old. And the refusal to surrender, she let a small breath out through her nose, goes back so far we have lost the date. Kuthan spoke. His voice was careful. You are saying that humans did not invent these methods. I am saying that humans perfected them, Voss replied. Because we had to. Because the alternative was extinction. And we have been very, very motivated to avoid extinction. There was a long silence. Ambassador Drell's heavy-lidded eyes had opened wider than Voss had seen them. He was looking at the scrolling list of battles on the display. She watched him read it, or try to. It was very long. You fought each other, said one of the other delegates, a smaller being, with pale, papery skin and large ears. The Solon representative. She had barely spoken in the prior session. All of these conflicts, were between humans? The great majority of them, yes, Voss said. The Solon delegate looked at her colleagues. She looked back at Voss. And you, survived that? We're here, aren't we? The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Voss stood at the center of the floor and let it run. She did not try to fill it. The delegates needed a moment to let what she had said settle into them. She understood that. She gave it to them. It was Kuthan who broke it. Admiral Voss, he said slowly, even if we accept the historical context you have described, and I am not saying we accept it, the charges before this tribunal are not about history. They are about conduct in a current engagement. The rules your forces violated are the rules of this accord, which Earth has formally accepted. Accepted, Voss said, does not mean agreed with, it means agreed to follow. And I will address each charge in detail if the tribunal wishes. But I wanted this council to understand what it is actually asking, before we get into the legal language. She looked at them all in turn. You are not asking humanity to fight differently. You are asking humanity to forget 2,500 years of the only thing that kept us alive. She paused. That is a very large ask. Kuthan's mandibles were still. The chamber was still. Even the hum of the station seemed to have gone quiet. We will recess, Kuthan said finally, and reconvene tomorrow morning. As the delegates filed out, Voss walked back to the respondents' table and began collecting her data drive. Halleck leaned in close. That went well, he said quietly. It went as expected, she said. You scared them. She looked up at the gallery, which was slowly emptying, alien faces turning back for one last look before they disappeared through the exits. Good, she said. They should pay attention. She picked up her drive and headed for the door. In the corridor, one of the tribunal's junior staff, a young creature with pale green skin, pressed itself against the wall to let her pass. As she walked by, she heard it make a very small sound. She was not sure what the sound meant in its language, but the expression on its face looked a lot like awe. The recess was supposed to last one night. It lasted 2 days. Voss heard pieces of what was happening behind the closed doors of the delegate chambers. She heard it the way information always travels in places like this, through overheard conversations, through the careful observations of Halleck, who had a gift for being near doorways at the right moment, and through the tribunal's own junior staff, some of whom seemed to have made the quiet decision that they found the humans more interesting than they found their employers. What was happening behind those doors was an argument. The Vethkai delegate, Kuthan, was pushing hard. He had come to this tribunal to win, and the evidence he had built was solid. He had recordings, he had article numbers, he had timestamps and casualty figures. He had a case, and he was not going to let Voss's history lesson knock it over. He argued that the historical context she had presented was irrelevant to the legal question. It did not matter how long humans had been fighting this way. What mattered was that they had agreed to the accord, and the accord had rules, and those rules had been broken. Several of the other delegates agreed with him. The Molhan delegate agreed with him. The delegate from the Solon Combine, the one with pale skin and large ears, who had asked the quiet question about survival, agreed with him also, though according to Halleck, she seemed less certain about it than she had been at the start of the session. But then there was Ambassador Drell. The aquatic reptilian had been quiet throughout the proceedings. He had watched and listened. He had asked very few questions. But behind the closed doors of the recess chamber, he had apparently found his voice, and what he said had changed the temperature of the argument considerably. He had read the Accord's founding charter, not just the sections that dealt with combat regulations, the whole thing. He had apparently spent the entire first night of recess going through it, and on the morning of the second day, he had come to the meeting with a specific passage. It was from the original founding principles, written before the combat regulations, before the membership agreements, before all the structures that had been built on top of the original document. It was old language, formal and careful. Halleck had managed to get a copy of the passage Drell had read aloud. He had brought it to Voss on a small data card. She had read it 3 times. The passage said, "Combat law governs method, not outcome. Outcome is the sovereign right of any party in a conflict. No member species may be judged solely for achieving the result their forces sought, provided no explicit provision of this charter was materially violated." Voss had put the data card down on the table in her room and looked at the ceiling. The Accord's own founders had written that method could be governed, outcome could not, and if all of the human tactics at Cathara had violated tradition, had violated the unwritten assumptions of how war was supposed to look, but had not violated the explicit written provisions of the charter in a material and clear way, then the legal foundation of the charges began to crack. Drell, it turned out, was a very careful reader. When the session reopened on the morning of the third day, the chamber felt different again, heavier. The delegates who had seemed confident before were now less so. Kuthan was the exception. His mandibles were moving constantly. He had clearly spent the recess looking for a way to save his case, and he had found one remaining thread he intended to pull. He opened the session himself, before Voss had a chance to speak. "The tribunal has reviewed the passage raised by Ambassador Drell," he said, "and we acknowledge its relevance to several of the charges on the list. We are prepared to set those charges aside, pending further legal review." A pause, brief and controlled. "However, one charge remains that we believe is not addressed by the founding charter passage, and it is the one I consider most serious. The charge of psychological warfare." He looked at Voss. The audio broadcast at Cathara was a deliberate attempt to disorient and destabilize the mental state of enemy combatants. This goes beyond tactical deception. This is an attack on the soldier as a thinking being, not on the soldier as a physical threat. The Accord's Article 9 is explicit. Combatants retain the right to mental integrity in the field. You cannot weaponize a person's own mind against them. He let that land. "But the audio broadcast is not actually my central concern," Kuthan continued, and now his voice changed, just slightly. Became something more personal. Something that surprised Voss, because she had not expected honesty from him here. "My central concern is the laughter." The gallery stirred. The Accord's observer report from the incident, involving the 15 surrounded soldiers, notes the following. The Vethkai field commander issued a lawful surrender signal on the correct frequency, in the correct format, at close enough range to be unmistakable. The surrounded soldiers heard it. Their own recordings confirm they heard it. He looked at the notes in front of him, then looked up. They laughed, and then they attacked soldiers who outnumbered them 4-1. He paused again. This pause was different from the others. It was not a legal pause. It was the pause of someone trying to understand something that genuinely troubled them. I have spoken with Vethkai soldiers who were present at that engagement, the ones who survived the breakout. I asked them what it felt like when the surrounded humans laughed. I will tell you what they said. He folded all 4 arms in front of him. They said they were afraid, not of the humans as soldiers. They were already outnumbered. They had already won by every reasonable measure. They were afraid because the humans were surrounded, outmatched, and facing capture, and they were not afraid. And something that is not afraid when it should be afraid is not operating by any rules that can be understood or predicted. The gallery was absolutely silent now. Kuthon looked at Voss directly. So I ask you, Admiral, not as a legal question, as a sincere question, from one living being to another, what kind of creature laughs when it is about to die? The question hung in the air of the chamber. It was not a trap. Voss understood that now, looking at his still mandibles and his large compound eyes that caught the light in small fragments. He was actually asking. He had been building this case for months, had gathered his evidence and his articles and his arguments, and underneath all of it, this was the question he had actually wanted to answer. Voss looked at him for a moment. She thought about the 15 soldiers in that canyon. She thought about their names. She had looked them up, every one of them. She thought about the 3 who had not come back, and the 12 who had. She thought about what it meant to be surrounded and outnumbered, and to look at the soldiers across from you and laugh. She leaned forward slightly and spoke into the microphone. The kind that isn't planning to. The gallery erupted. It was not applause. It was something between shock and sound. A room full of different species all reacting at once in their own ways. The Mohan delegate made the gasping sound again. The Solon delegate went very still. Several beings in the gallery were on their feet. 2 of the junior tribunal staff, standing near the side wall, looked at each other with wide eyes. Kuthon sat back in his seat. He did not speak for a long time. Voss sat quietly and let the room settle. Halleck, beside her, kept his face completely neutral, but she could see a small muscle working in his jaw. He was holding back a smile. When Kuthon finally spoke again, his voice was quieter than it had been at any point in the 3 days of proceedings. I think, he said slowly, that we need another recess. No one argued with that. As the gallery cleared and the delegates filed out, Voss sat at her table and did not move. She looked at the empty projection space in the center of the room. She thought about what had just happened. Not with satisfaction exactly, but with something like recognition. The moment had come together the way it needed to. The words had been right. After a while, Halleck set a small cup of water in front of her. She picked it up and drank. 2 more recesses, he said quietly. They're running out of room. They're running out of a case, she said. Same thing. She set the cup down. Not quite, she said. They still have tomorrow. And she looked at the empty room and waited for it. The 4th day began with fog. Not real fog. The station was sealed and pressurized. No weather reached inside it. But there was something in the air of the main chamber when Voss entered that reminded her of fog. A heaviness, a kind of stillness that comes when visibility is low and you are not entirely sure what is in front of you. The gallery was full again. If anything, it was fuller than the first day. Word had spread across the station. The beings who sat up in the elevated rows were quiet and attentive, and there were more of them than before. Some had clearly come specifically for this session, having heard reports of what had happened in the days prior. The 7 delegates were already in their seats. Kuthon sat in his place with his arms folded and his mandibles still. Ambassador Drell sat with his moisture-sealed collar slightly loosened, which Voss had come to recognize as a sign that he was more relaxed than usual. The Solon delegate had her hands flat on the bench in front of her, like someone holding themselves steady. When Kuthon spoke, he did not lead with arguments. The tribunal has reached its determination, he said. We will read the ruling now. Voss sat straight and kept her hands in her lap. The ruling took almost 20 minutes to read aloud, because it had to be read first in the Accord's formal language and then translated into every member species' tongue, simultaneously. Voss listened to the human language version through the small receiver Halleck had clipped to her collar before the session began. She listened carefully, even to the parts she already expected. Charges 1 through 12, all relating to the terrain sensor compound, were dismissed. The tribunal found that the compound used did not meet the definition of a prohibited environmental weapon under any current provision. It was a surface material. It affected sensors, not the living environment. Dismissed. Charges 13 through 22, relating to the audio broadcast, were also dismissed, but with conditions. The tribunal acknowledged that the broadcast had caused genuine distress to Vethkai personnel. However, the distress was auditory and temporary. Article 9's protections against psychological weapons applied to sustained, targeted mental interference, not to a sound broadcast of limited duration. Dismissed, with a note that the Accords Review Committee would examine whether the article needed to be updated to address such tactics going forward. Charges 23 through 39, the canyon collapse, were the ones Voss had been most uncertain about, and it showed in the length of the ruling on those particular points. The tribunal went back and forth visibly in its language, acknowledging the severity of the casualties, acknowledging that the action had been deliberate, before ultimately landing on the same ground that Ambassador Drell had raised in the recess. The Accord's founding charter held that outcome was sovereign. The canyon collapse had been an extreme act, but extreme was not the same as prohibited. Dismissed. The remaining charges, the psychological warfare count that Kuthon had argued most passionately, were the last to be addressed. The tribunal found that the specific behaviors cited, including the refusal to issue a surrender signal and the combative response when surrounded, did not fall under any provision of Article 9 as currently written. The actions were unusual. They were disorienting to opposing forces. But the Accord did not, and could not, require a member species to surrender at any particular moment or in any particular manner, so long as they did not engage in acts prohibited by specific text. All charges dismissed. The gallery did not erupt this time. There was a sound, a collective exhale almost, the sound of a large group of beings processing something together. But it was not noise. It was more like a change in the air pressure of the room. Kuthon waited for it to settle before he continued. This ruling, he said, does not constitute an endorsement of the tactics employed by Terran forces at the Kethera corridor engagement. The tribunal has significant concerns about certain aspects of human military conduct that fall outside the scope of the current charges. A formal review process will be initiated to determine whether the Accord's combat regulations require amendment in light of the methods demonstrated. Earth's delegation will be invited to participate in that process. She nodded once. This session is closed. The delegates rose. The gallery began to empty. Halleck leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath through his nose. It was the most visible emotional response Voss had seen from him in the entire 4 days. Good, he said simply. Expected, she said. He looked at her. You were not sure about the canyon charges. I was less sure, she admitted. Drell made it easier. Should we find a way to thank him? Not directly. He knows what he did. She began gathering her things. Around her, the chamber was clearing. The tribunal's junior staff were moving through the room, shutting down equipment, logging the session records. Most of them gave the 2 humans a wide berth. One of them, the young pale green one from the corridor, glanced at Voss as he passed, then quickly looked at the floor. She was nearly at the exit when she heard her name. Not her title, her name. Voss. She turned. Kuthon was standing near the base of the council bench, alone. The other delegates had already gone. He was not standing the way he had stood during the sessions, formally, arms folded, the posture of a prosecutor. He was standing the way anyone stands when they have set something heavy down and are not sure what to do with their hands. She told Halleck to wait by the door. Then she walked back. They stood facing each other in the half-empty chamber. The projectors had gone dark. The ceiling hummed softly with the station's environmental systems. I want to ask you something, Kuthon said. Not for the record, not for the tribunal. For myself. Ask, she said. He was quiet for a moment, as if finding the exact shape of the words he wanted. Do you understand, he said finally, how your species appears to the rest of the galaxy? Not in battle. In general. How we look at you. He paused. You arrived late. By galactic standards, you are very young. And in the short time since first contact, you have presented this accord with problems it did not anticipate, and frameworks it cannot fully contain. His mandibles moved once, slowly. But that is not what I mean. What I mean is this, your history. I had staff research it after your presentation, in detail. His compound eyes caught the light. You came close to ending yourselves so many times. Diseases that swept your whole world. Wars that flattened everything you built. You invented weapons that could have destroyed your planet, and you pointed them at each other. And then he stopped. Voss waited. And then you simply continued, he finished. Every time, you continued, you rebuilt, and you adapted, and you continued. And now you are here, in our accord with your fleet sitting in the neutral zone, and you stand in my tribunal and you smile, and none of us quite know what to do with you. He looked at her for a long moment. Does your species not see how that looks from the outside? You are a species that nearly destroyed itself 100 times over, and you are still here, and you seem almost, he searched for the word, comfortable with that fact. Voss looked at him. She took in the large compound eyes, the still mandibles, the careful posture of a being who had built a careful case and lost it, and was now standing in an empty room, asking the question that had been underneath the whole thing from the start. She thought about Earth, about the long history she had laid out in that display, all those centuries of fighting and dying and rebuilding. She thought about her soldiers at Cathara, outnumbered and surrounded, and the sound they had made. She thought about the 3 who had not made it home, and the 12 who had, and what it meant to be the kind of people who laughed, not because they did not understand the danger, but because they had decided the danger was not going to have the last word. She thought about every civilization that had come before them, and every disaster they had walked out of, still breathing, still moving, still building something new from whatever was left. And she felt the smile come, the same one from the first day, the one that was not about being happy, but about knowing something true. Yeah, she said. It came out quietly, warm, and completely honest. That's winning. Kuthan looked at her for a long moment. His mandibles did not move. His expression, across the gap of species and biology and 1,000 years of separate history, was hard to read. But Voss thought. She could not be certain, but she thought that what was in his eyes was not fear anymore. It was something more like understanding. He gave a small nod. Then he turned and walked toward the back of the chamber without another word. Voss stood alone in the center of the room for a moment. The projectors were dark, the seats were empty, the station hummed around her, cold and functional, and turning slowly in the dark between stars. Then she walked to the door where Halleck was waiting. Ready? He asked. Long time ago, she said. They walked out together into the corridor and toward the shuttle that would take them back to the fleet. Outside the station's hull, invisible and patient, the Terran cruisers sat in holding pattern, engines warm, waiting for the order to move. The galaxy had spent centuries settling into its assumptions. It had agreed on how war looked, how soldiers behaved, what it meant to fight and to lose and to stop. It had built its rules carefully and believed in them. And then humanity had arrived. Late, small by galactic standards, scarred from a history that no other species had lived through, and had simply kept going. Not because humans were the strongest, not because they were the smartest, or the fastest, or the most advanced, but because somewhere in those 2,500 years of fighting and surviving and getting back up, they had learned something no rule, and no treaty, and no tribunal could take away from them. They had learned that the thing which keeps trying does not lose. Not really.